You're sitting in the dark. The music swells. And right there, on your arms, on the back of your neck, something rises without your permission. You didn't ask your skin to do that. You didn't tell it to. It just happened the second that chord hit. Most people call it a chill, a shiver, goosebumps. But the real answer for why your body does this is far stranger than a chill, and it has almost nothing to do with the movie you're watching. It has to do with fur you don't have anymore. Let's start with what's actually happening under your skin, because the mechanics alone are strange enough to slow down for. Every single hair on your body sits inside a tiny pocket called a follicle. And attached to that follicle, just underneath the surface of your skin, is a microscopic muscle called the erector pili. That's just Latin for the muscle that raises the hair. When that muscle contracts, it does two things at once. It pulls the hair upright, and it tugs the skin around it into a small, hard bump. That's the goosebump. Not the hair. The dimple the muscle leaves behind when it yanks the hair follicle taut. Now here's the part that should stop you. You have roughly 5 million of these hair follicles on your body, almost as many as a chimpanzee. The difference isn't the follicles, it's what's growing out of them. Somewhere in your evolutionary past, the thick coat that should be sitting on top of all that machinery thinned out into nearly nothing. But the muscles stayed, the wiring stayed. Every single one of those 5 million tiny motors is still installed, still connected to your nervous system, still ready to fire on command. You're not growing a new reflex when you get goosebumps. You're running a very old one on hardware that no longer has a coat to lift. So why did that muscle exist in the first place? Why would evolution wire 5 million microscopic hair raisers into a body? Go back further. Go back to before you were you, back to an ancestor covered in real fur, thick and dense across the whole body. For that animal, two problems kept showing up again and again: cold and threat, and the erector pili muscle solved both. Start with cold. Fur works as insulation the same way a puffer jacket works. It's not the fur itself that keeps an animal warm, it's the air trapped inside the fur. Flat fur traps almost nothing. But raise every hair even slightly, and suddenly there's a whole layer of insulating air sitting against the skin, holding body heat in like a blanket that just inflated itself. When a furred mammal gets cold, the erector pili muscles fire automatically. The fur puffs upright, and the animal effectively grows a thicker coat in under a second, with zero conscious effort. Watch a dog in winter, or a cat that's been outside too long. The fur along its spine and shoulders visibly thickens. That's not new hair. That's the exact same reflex sitting in your arms right now, just with something left to lift. Then there's threat. This one's even older, and honestly a little more theatrical. When a threatened animal needs to look bigger, fast, the same muscle fires again, but for a completely different reason. A frightened cat arches its back and its fur stands on end, and in about half a second it looks nearly twice its actual size to whatever's threatening it. A porcupine does the same thing with quills instead of fur, which are really just modified hairs attached to the exact same kind of muscle. A startled bird fluffs every feather on its body in an instant. Different species, different coverings, same underlying trick. Make yourself look bigger, look more dangerous, and maybe the threat backs off before anything has to happen at all. Think about how efficient that really is. One tiny muscle, repeated 5 million times across the body, solving two completely different survival problems without needing two separate systems. Evolution rarely builds something new when it can just find a second use for something that already works. And this particular muscle turned out to be almost absurdly good at its job. Arctic mammals like foxes and wolves can double the insulating power of their coat in seconds using this exact reflex, without spending a single calorie growing new fur. That matters enormously in an environment where every calorie is the difference between surviving the night and not. And the threat response wasn't just about looking bigger for a split second. Watch it closely and it starts to look almost strategic. A raised coat doesn't just add size, it also breaks up an animal's outline, making it harder for a predator to judge exactly where the body actually ends and the fur begins. A porcupine mid-threat display isn't only bigger, its silhouette becomes genuinely confusing to read at a glance, which buys precious extra seconds in a confrontation where seconds are everything. Even something as small as a startled mouse will raise the fur along its spine when cornered, a last, almost pathetic-looking attempt to seem like more trouble than it's worth. It rarely works against a determined predator. But across millions of years and millions of close calls, even a small percentage improvement in the odds of surviving an encounter was enough for the reflex to stick around, generation after generation, animal after animal. So somewhere back in your ancestry, one muscle did two jobs: trap heat when you're cold, bluff size when you're scared. Both were about survival. Neither one had anything to do with music or art or a song that makes your chest ache. And that's the twist that should genuinely stop you for a second. Because the fur is gone. It's been gone for a very long time, and yet the goosebumps didn't leave with it. Somewhere in your evolutionary history, your body lost almost all of its fur, most likely as a way to sweat more efficiently and cool down while hunting across open, hot terrain. But the reflex controlling that now useless fur stayed completely wired in, sitting there fully functional with nothing left to raise. And instead of quietly disappearing over hundreds of thousands of years, that reflex did something almost nobody expects. It got repurposed. It started firing for reasons that have nothing to do with temperature and nothing to do with a predator standing in front of you. Play someone a piece of music that hits exactly the right chord change, the kind that arrives after just enough tension has built up, and their arms will bump right on cue. Show someone a scene in a film at the precise moment a character finally reunites with someone they lost, and the same reflex fires. Researchers even have a clinical name for this specific version of it. They call it frisson, a French word that basically means a shiver of emotion. And frisson isn't triggered by cold. It isn't triggered by fear of a predator. It's triggered by something closer to being moved. Awe. Recognition. The exact instant a piece of art lands. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, though. Why would a reflex built for insulation and intimidation start firing for beauty? For a long time, scientists didn't even take this question seriously. Goosebumps triggered by music were treated as a footnote, a quirky side effect not worth deep study, while the cold and fear responses got most of the research attention. That changed once researchers started noticing how measurable and predictable emotional goosebumps actually are. Play the same swelling piece of music to the same person on different days, under controlled lab conditions, and the goosebumps will often appear at nearly the identical moment in the recording every single time, down to the second. That kind of precision doesn't look like randomness. It looks like a very specific mechanism being triggered by a very specific pattern, the same way a lock only opens for the one key shaped to fit it. Neuroscientists have traced this down to your brain's reward circuitry, the same dopamine pathway that lights up when you eat something you crave or fall in love or win at something you care about. Brain scans of people listening to music that reliably gives them chills show a spike in dopamine right as the goosebumps rise, specifically in a region tied to anticipation and emotional payoff. Somewhere in the wiring, the ancient hair-raising reflex got looped into the exact same circuit your brain uses to signal something meaningful just happened. Not something dangerous, not something cold, something significant. Your body, in other words, is still using its oldest possible alarm system, but now it's ringing that alarm for beauty instead of threat. And that alone raises a question worth sitting with for a second. If Goosebumps evolved purely for temperature and intimidation, why does the reflex show up so reliably during moments that carry almost no physical danger at all? A eulogy at a funeral. The national anthem before a game. A story that suddenly clicks into place at the very end. None of those moments are cold. None of them are threatening, and yet the oldest survival reflex in your skin fires anyway, right on schedule. Every time. There's a theory for this, and it's a strangely moving one. Some researchers argue that frisson happens specifically at moments of what's called prediction violation, when something unfolds in a way that's slightly different from what your brain expected, but in a way that resolves beautifully instead of badly. A chord goes somewhere unexpected, but lands perfectly. A story sets up a question, then answers it in a way you didn't see coming. Your brain, which spends nearly all of its energy trying to predict what happens next, briefly gets surprised in the best possible way, and the ancient alert system built for danger fires as a kind of exclamation point. Not because you're in danger, because your brain just registered something worth marking as important. Which means the very same biological machinery built to warn your ancestors of a wolf in the grass is now the same machinery that tells you a song just did something remarkable to your chest. It isn't only music either. Watch what happens to people during genuine moments of awe, the kind that has nothing to do with entertainment at all. Standing at the edge of a canyon so large it doesn't look real. Watching a total solar eclipse turn day into a strange, cold twilight in the middle of the afternoon. Hearing a crowd of thousands sing the exact same words at the exact same second. In every one of these cases, people across wildly different cultures, with no shared language and no coordination, report the same physical sensation. Chills. Raised skin. A reflex their ancestors built for cold and predators, now firing because they feel suddenly, overwhelmingly small in front of something vast. Even grief carries this same fingerprint. Ask people what physically happens to them at the exact moment they hear devastating news, and a striking number will describe the same sensation rising up their arms and across the back of their neck, arriving seconds before the tears do. The reflex isn't choosy about which emotion counts as significant enough to trigger it. Fear, love, grief, awe, and sudden beauty all seem to route through the same ancient switch. There's something worth noticing in just how consistent this is across people who otherwise have almost nothing in common. Researchers who study frisson have found that somewhere between 2/3 and nearly all adults report experiencing it at some point, and the moments that trigger it tend to cluster around a small handful of patterns no matter who's being studied. A sudden change in volume after a quiet passage. A voice cracking with real emotion instead of performed emotion. A moment of unexpected unity, like a stadium full of strangers singing in perfect unison. None of these moments share a language, a culture, or a religion. What they share is a structure, a build, a held breath, and then a release that lands somewhere your brain didn't quite predict. It's almost as if the reflex is less interested in what caused the feeling and more interested in the shape of the feeling itself. Interestingly, not everyone's reflex fires the same way, and that turns out to be a clue rather than a flaw. Studies using personality measures have found that people who score higher on a trait called openness to experience, the tendency to seek out and deeply engage with new ideas, art, and sensations, report frisson far more often than people who score lower on that same trait. That doesn't mean anyone is missing the reflex. The wiring is there in essentially everyone. It simply means some brains are more prone to registering that specific kind of prediction violation as significant enough to pull the trigger. In a strange way, the muscle in your skin might be quietly reporting something about the way your mind engages with the world around it. So by now, the shape of the real answer should be coming into focus. And it's not really about goosebumps at all. It's about how astonishingly good evolution is at repurposing old machinery instead of throwing it away. Your body didn't invent a new system to help you cry at a wedding, or feel your chest tighten at the final notes of a song, or freeze at the edge of a canyon. It reused the exact same wiring that once helped a furred ancestor survive a cold night or bluff its way past a predator. Nothing new was built. Something ancient was simply given a new job. And that's what makes the next time it happens worth paying attention to. Because now you know what's actually going on underneath your skin. 5 million microscopic muscles, wired into your nervous system since long before you were born, sitting there with almost nothing left to lift. And every so often, when a piece of music resolves in exactly the right way, or a story lands harder than you expected, or you stand somewhere too vast to fully take in, those same ancient muscles fire anyway. Not because you're cold. Not because anything is hunting you. But because somewhere deep in your nervous system, a signal built millions of years ago for survival has just been repurposed to mark the moment as something worth remembering. You're not imagining that reaction. You're not being dramatic when a song gives you chills, or when a scene in a film makes the hair on your arms rise without permission. You're running a reflex built for a body you don't have anymore, on a coat of fur that vanished so long ago, almost nothing else about it survived. Except this. Except the muscle. Except the reflex your ancestors needed to survive a cold night, now quietly repurposed to tell you when something has moved you. So the next time you're sitting in the dark, and the music swells, and something rises on your skin without your permission, you'll know exactly what's happening. It isn't a chill. It isn't your imagination. It's 5 million-year-old machinery built for a coat of fur you no longer have. Firing anyway, because somewhere inside you, it still knows the difference between a moment that matters and one that doesn't.